What if I told you the person who loved you the deepest was never the one who shouted, argued, or demanded attention, but the one who quietly disappeared without a sound? Because the real heartbreak isn't when they leave you physically, it's when they leave you emotionally, long before you even realize it started happening. And I want you to think about this for a second. Have you ever had someone who felt everything so deeply, so intensely, that one day they just became quieter, distant, almost like they were still there, but not really there anymore? If yes, stay with me, because what you are about to understand will completely change how you see love, silence, and emotional withdrawal. There is a type of person you can love deeply and still lose without a single argument, without shouting, without a final message, and without any dramatic goodbye.
It happens so quietly that you may not even realize it at first. One day everything feels normal, and the next, something feels missing. They are still physically present for a while, still replying, still showing up, but emotionally they have already stepped back. Long before the distance becomes visible, they have already started leaving on the inside. And the hardest part for most people to accept is this simple truth: you did not lose them the day they walked away. You lost them the moment they stopped feeling emotionally safe in your presence, when their inner world quietly decided to retreat for protection rather than connection. To understand this kind of person, you cannot start with their behavior in adulthood. You have to go back to the beginning, to the environment that shaped how they learned to survive emotionally. This is not just a personality style or a mood pattern. It is something much deeper, built slowly over time through repeated emotional experiences.
A trauma-adapted empath is not born fully formed. They are shaped through conditions that teach them how to feel everything and still remain functional in a world that may not understand their depth. Their nervous system learns early that sensitivity is not always welcomed, and that lesson changes the way they move through life. As a child, this person was not distant or closed off. In fact, they were often the opposite. They were open in a way that only children can be when they have not yet learned to protect themselves. They trusted without hesitation. They expressed without filtering, and they connected without questioning motives. Their emotional world was wide open. They did not analyze feelings, they lived inside them. Everything was experienced fully and immediately, without distance. When they felt joy, it was complete. When they felt pain, it was overwhelming.
There was no separation between what was happening around them and what was happening inside them.
At a neurological level, some individuals are born with highly responsive mirror neuron systems, meaning their brains naturally reflect and simulate the emotions of others. In simple terms, they do not just observe emotions, they absorb them. If someone near them feels sadness, tension, or anger, they don't just recognize it logically, they experience a version of it internally. Even before they develop language for emotions, they are already processing emotional environments intuitively. They can sense shifts in tone, changes in energy, and emotional discomfort long before anything is openly expressed. To them, emotional reality is not spoken first, it is felt first. Now imagine what this means for a child growing up in that state of sensitivity. They're constantly open, constantly receiving, and constantly processing emotional information from their surroundings. This level of emotional awareness is powerful, but without safety, it becomes overwhelming. It is not a weakness in itself, it is an amplifier. And like any amplifier, what matters is the environment it is placed in. In a healthy environment, where emotions are acknowledged, respected, and safely expressed, this sensitivity develops into emotional intelligence. The child learns to understand people deeply without losing themselves. But in an environment where emotions are dismissed, ignored, or punished, the same sensitivity becomes something entirely different. It becomes a burden. And this shift does not always come through obvious trauma. Sometimes it is subtle, repeated, and quiet. It is the parent who is warm one moment and emotionally absent the next. It is affection that feels unpredictable. It is attention that must be earned rather than freely given. Or it is simply the absence of emotional acknowledgement altogether. The child expresses something real, something genuine, and instead of being met with understanding, they hear phrases like, "You're too sensitive," "Stop overreacting," or "Be strong." Without realizing it, the child's nervous system begins to learn a powerful rule. Expressing emotions openly is not safe. This learning does not happen in words, but in repeated experiences. It becomes embedded in their body and brain. Importantly, they do not stop feeling. That is not possible for them. Their emotional depth remains intact. Instead, they begin to adapt in a more complex way. They separate what they feel internally from what they show externally. Inside, everything remains intense and alive. Outside, they begin to regulate, filter, and control their expression. Over time, this adaptation becomes automatic. They start pausing before they speak, thinking before they trust, and observing before they engage. They develop a constant awareness not only of others, but of how they themselves are being perceived. This is often where people misinterpret them. What looks like emotional distance is actually careful processing. What looks like withdrawal is actually self-protection. They are constantly calculating what is safe to reveal and what must remain hidden. It is not avoidance of connection, it is management of vulnerability. As this pattern continues into adulthood, others begin to form assumptions about them. Their calmness is mistaken for lack of feeling. Their independence is seen as not needing anyone. Their emotional restraint is interpreted as stability or detachment. But in reality, what people are seeing is containment. It is a system built over time that has learned to hold emotional intensity internally because expressing it freely once led to discomfort, misunderstanding, or emotional pain. They have learned that holding everything inside feels safer than being fully seen and possibly misunderstood again. This is why they often appear composed in situations where others might feel overwhelmed. It is not because they do not feel deeply. It is because they learned early how to process intensity alone. They carry emotional weight internally without external expression. Over time, a core belief begins to form, not as a conscious thought, but as an internal pattern. I can feel everything deeply, but I must do it privately. This belief shapes how they move through relationships, conversations, and emotional closeness. In relationships, they do not stop caring, giving, or connecting. They are still capable of deep attachment and loyalty. However, there is always an invisible boundary present, a quiet internal line that defines how close someone is allowed to get. It is not built to control others, but to protect themselves from emotional overwhelm. They allow closeness slowly, carefully, and conditionally. Trust is not given instantly, it is observed over time. And underneath it all, there's a constant awareness of safety, even when everything appears calm on the surface. They are observing you to protect themselves. What looks like distance is not disinterest, and what feels like silence is not absence of feeling. It is a careful internal process shaped by experience, not emotion alone. The child who once gave everything without hesitation eventually learned through repeated moments that not every environment can hold that level of emotional truth. Not every person can handle intensity, honesty, or vulnerability without misunderstanding it. And slowly, through lived experience rather than instruction, they came to a quiet conclusion that changes everything about how they relate to the world. Who I am cannot be fully exposed without awareness. Who I am must be managed.
This realization does not come in one moment.
It forms gradually through layers of emotional memory that shape how safety is defined inside them. Because of this, it becomes important to stop mislabeling them based on surface behavior. They are not simply distant, cold, or complicated. These labels are easy, but they are also incomplete. When you look deeper, you are not dealing with a lack of emotion or depth. You are dealing with an individual who learned that depth, when placed in the wrong environment, has consequences. And those consequences are not always immediate. Sometimes they are subtle, emotional, and cumulative. So instead of expressing everything outwardly, they begin to regulate what is shown, when it is shown, and to whom it is shown. What you see is not the full emotional system, only the filtered version of it. Most people misunderstand this dynamic because they interpret behavior without understanding the system behind it. On the surface, their behavior appears inconsistent. One moment, they are fully present, attentive, emotionally engaged, and responsive in a way that feels rare and meaningful. There is warmth, focus, and a sense of genuine connection that feels real. And then, without a clear event or explanation, there is a shift. They become quieter, more reserved, less emotionally available, and harder to reach. To someone observing from the outside, this appears like unpredictability, as if their interest comes and goes without reason. But this interpretation misses the deeper mechanism at work. What looks like inconsistency is actually controlled exposure. It is not emotional instability, but emotional regulation based on internal risk assessment. For a trauma-adapted empath, connection is never casual. It is always processed through the lens of safety. Their past experiences have taught them that closeness is not automatically safe, even when it feels good in the moment.
So when they begin to connect, two systems activate at the same time.
One system seeks closeness, understanding, and emotional bonding. The other system monitors for risk, inconsistency, and emotional cost. These two systems do not take turns. They operate simultaneously. This is the paradox they live with internally. They can sit with you, listen deeply, understand your emotional state, and still, in the background, be evaluating whether the connection is safe enough to continue at the same level of openness. This is not overthinking in the casual sense. It is a deeply learned pattern of emotional survival. Their awareness is always split between experience and observation of experience. Because of this, connection unfolds slowly. They do not reveal everything at once. Instead, they share small pieces of themselves, one layer at a time. Not because they are hiding, but because they are testing emotional safety through real interaction. They may mention something personal, something meaningful, but not the full depth of it. Then they watch what happens next. How is it received? Is it respected? Is it dismissed? Is it used later in a way that feels unsafe? Every response becomes information. Every interaction becomes data for emotional calibration. It is important to be precise here. This is not manipulation. It is pattern recognition developed through experience. When someone has lived in environments where emotional signals were inconsistent, unpredictable, or unsafe, they learn to rely less on words and more on behavior over time. What people say matters less than what they consistently do. Promises can be made easily. Emotional intensity can appear in short bursts. But consistency reveals something deeper, something more reliable. This is why consistency becomes everything to them. Not intensity, not emotional speeches, not dramatic expressions of care. consistency. Because intensity can be performed in short periods, it can feel real and still not be stable. But consistency requires alignment over time. It requires emotional steadiness even when situations change. It requires presence that does not collapse when things become complex or quiet. And for someone whose nervous system is built around emotional scanning, this is what creates safety. Because of that, they often appear as if they are testing others. But it is not a conscious test in the way people assume. It is an unconscious observation of patterns. Can this person remain steady under emotional silence? Can they respect boundaries without taking it personally? Can they stay present without needing constant reassurance? These are not questions they ask directly. These are patterns they observe over time through behavior. When people misunderstand this process, they often react incorrectly. They interpret the quiet shifts as loss of interest. They assume something is going wrong. They feel anxiety and respond by increasing emotional pressure, seeking reassurance, or trying to force clarity. But from the perspective of the trauma-adapted empath, this reaction changes the emotional environment. Instead of increasing safety, it increases emotional intensity and pressure. And when emotional pressure rises too quickly, their nervous system interprets it as instability. Not necessarily danger from the person, but danger in the emotional pattern. As a result, they begin to reduce exposure, not out of punishment and not out of lack of care, but as a form of self-stabilization. They step back internally before stepping back externally. This is where withdrawal begins, long before it is visible. They are not afraid of the person themselves. They are afraid of what emotional closeness might do to their internal balance if it becomes overwhelming or inconsistent. In their history, closeness has often been paired with unpredictability. So even when something feels good, it is approached with caution. The nervous system remembers what the conscious mind may try to override. If you understand this, your response changes. You stop interpreting distance as rejection. You stop reacting to silence as loss. You begin to see patterns instead of moments. And more importantly, you stop trying to force emotional speed. You allow connection to develop at a pace that does not overwhelm their system. Because for them, safety is not optional. It is the entry point for everything else. When safety is established over time, something changes internally. The need for constant monitoring begins to decrease. The layers do not disappear all at once, but they begin to relax. Emotional presence becomes more natural. Trust is no longer something they are constantly recalibrating. But this only happens in environments where consistency replaces unpredictability, and where emotional pressure is not mistaken for emotional closeness. And yet, most people never reach this point. Not because of one major mistake, but because of repeated small misunderstandings. Each misunderstanding adds pressure. Each assumption creates distance. And over time, what was once a potential connection slowly shifts into emotional withdrawal. Not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, through patterns that were never fully understood in time. They assume that because this person appears strong, they do not need support. They assume that because this person is quiet, they are content. They assume that because this person does not ask, there is nothing to give. And this is exactly where the breakdown begins. Because what looks like independence is often self-reliance formed out of necessity, not preference. This individual learned early that their emotional needs might not be consistently met. So instead of depending on others, they developed the ability to manage everything alone, emotionally, mentally, and internally. But capability is not the same as absence of need, and this distinction is where most misunderstandings start. To be precise, they can carry everything by themselves, but that does not mean they want to, and it definitely does not mean they are unaffected by doing so. This is the central misunderstanding that causes many relationships with them to fail. People observe what is visible: calm behavior, stability, low maintenance presence, and they assume that the inner world matches the outer expression. But internally, the need still exists. The need to be seen, to be understood, and to be cared for without having to constantly explain why. The difference is that they will not ask for it directly, because asking is not emotionally neutral for them. For them, asking for help or emotional support is connected to past experiences where expressing needs led to disappointment or emotional neglect. So instead of asking, they observe. They watch what you do without instruction. Do you notice changes in their tone? Do you check in when they become quiet? Do you offer support without being prompted? This is how they evaluate connection, not through words, but through awareness, not through declarations, but through behavior that happens without being requested. This is where the gap between most people and deeply aware individuals becomes clear. The majority of people operate reactively. They respond when something is said, when something is shown, or when something is directly requested. In most relationships, this approach works because communication is explicit. But in this case, it is different.
By the time something is spoken by them, it has already been felt, processed internally, and often endured alone for some time.
So reactive responses often arrive too late to feel meaningful. A smaller group of people operate differently. They are attentive without being intrusive. They do not control or overanalyze, but they remain aware. They notice subtle shifts, such as changes in tone, emotional rhythm, or silence that last longer than usual. Instead of ignoring these signs or reacting with panic, they respond calmly. A simple acknowledgement, a grounded presence, something like, "You seem a bit distant, I'm here," without pressure or expectation. That kind of response creates emotional safety because it does not demand explanation. Consistency in presence builds something very important for someone whose earlier environment was unstable: predictability. And predictability is not exciting for them, but it is safe. It allows their system to relax gradually because it contradicts what they previously learned about relationships being unpredictable. Over time, they begin to register a new experience. This person remains steady even when nothing is being demanded. And that slowly begins to reshape internal expectations about closeness. A common mistake at this stage is misinterpreting their silence or temporary withdrawal. When they pull back slightly, many people assume rejection. That assumption leads to emotional pressure, questions, or attempts to force clarity. But this reaction often creates the opposite effect. It increases emotional intensity, which their nervous system interprets as instability. And when instability rises, their system responds by creating more distance. Not because they do not care, but because they are trying to regulate emotional overload internally. Those who understand this dynamic respond differently. They do not chase or withdraw in response. They remain present without demanding immediate closeness. They stay steady even when the other person creates space. And this steadiness sends a very clear message: your need for space does not threaten me. For someone with a history of emotional unpredictability, this is rare. They became highly sensitive to tone, expression, and emotional shifts because at some point, understanding others was not optional, it was protective. Neuroscience helps explain this. This process cannot be rushed. Any attempt to force emotional closeness too quickly is interpreted as pressure, and pressure is linked to the original emotional wound. So the only effective approach is steady presence without intrusion, care without control, and patience without expectation of immediate reward. And most importantly, their silence must not be taken personally, because it is not directed at you as an individual. It is a reflection of what their system learned long before you arrived in their life. When you understand this, your response shifts from emotional reaction to emotional awareness. And that difference determines everything about whether the connection collapses or develops into something stable. In the end, this entire understanding comes down to one simple truth. Some people do not express emotions in obvious ways, but that does not mean they feel any less. What appears as silence, distance, or calm behavior is often a reflection of how a person has learned to protect their inner world after past emotional experiences. When someone becomes more reserved, it is not always rejection. And when someone does not ask for support, it is not always because they do not need it. Often, it is because they have learned to carry things quietly in order to feel safe. Healthy connection is never built on assumptions, pressure, or fear of misunderstanding. It is built on respect, patience, and steady communication where both people feel emotionally safe. When we stop interpreting behavior too quickly and start trying to understand the human experience behind it, relationships become more balanced and less confusing. Silence does not always mean absence, and distance does not always mean disinterest. True understanding comes when we allow space for others to be different from our expectations, while also maintaining our own emotional stability. In the end, the strongest connections are not the ones filled with intensity or constant reassurance, but the ones where both people feel safe enough to be real, even in their quietest moments.